The town of Delrose had a way of talking about Savannah the way people talk about weather, as something that simply was, something you noted and moved past. She was 26 years old, unmarried, and according to most who knew her, perfectly fine. She ate. She slept. She walked to the market on Tuesdays and nodded at the women who greeted her on the porch steps of Hattie Cobb's dry goods store. She answered when spoken to. She never caused trouble. But Silas Thornwell had seen her laugh once, really laugh, the kind that catches in the throat before it escapes. And that was 7 years ago, and that was the problem. Because the woman moving through Delrose now wore that same face and those same quiet eyes, and she had not laughed like that even once in the 3 weeks he had been watching. He had not come to Delrose looking for her. That was the truth he told himself every morning. He had come for work. There was a cattle operation 2 miles east of town that needed an extra hand through the dry season, and Silas had needed the distance from Caldwell County and everything he had left behind there. But then he had walked into Hattie Cobb's on his second day in town to buy a tin of tobacco, and Savannah had been standing at the counter with a small paper list in her hand, and something in his chest had shifted the way a door shifts when the wind changes direction outside. She had not recognized him. He had not expected her to. Their one encounter had been a forgettable afternoon at a harvest social in Greer's Crossing. She had been laughing with a group of women near the fence line, and he had returned a dropped ribbon to her, and she had smiled and said thank you kindly and turned back to her friends. That was all. That was everything, apparently, because Silas had thought about that smile on and off for 7 years without fully understanding why. What he understood now was that the smile was gone. It was not grief, exactly. Silas had seen grief. His mother after his father passed, his older brother after the war. Grief had a shape to it, a visible wound that people worked around carefully. What Savannah carried was different. It was more like an absence. As though somewhere along the years between that harvest social and this dry Tuesday morning in Delrose, she had quietly set herself down somewhere and simply not picked herself back up. The women in town were kind to her. In the distracted way people are kind to furniture, they have stopped truly seeing. Her mother had passed 2 winters back. Her father had moved to live with a cousin in New Mexico territory shortly after, leaving Savannah the small house on the edge of Delrose and a modest sum that would not last forever. She had no siblings, no suitors that anyone mentioned seriously. She existed in Delrose the way a pressed flower exists inside a forgotten book, preserved, but no longer growing. Silas learned most of this from Earl Dobbs, the older man who ran the stable where he boarded his horse. Earl talked the way some old men do, freely, without being asked, as though conversation was something he owed the world. "Savannah Pierce," Earl had said one evening, watching Silas brush down his roan. "Good family, quiet girl. Always was, I suppose, but used to be a different kind of quiet. Now it's the kind that makes you a little uneasy if you think on it too long." Silas had thought on it too long. That was becoming a pattern. He spoke to her properly for the first time on a Wednesday, near the well at the south end of town. She was drawing water with a slow, mechanical patience that had nothing hurried or peaceful about it. It was simply the motion of someone completing a task because tasks existed and time had to be filled somehow. "Can I help you with that?" he said. It was not really a question. She looked at him with those steady, unreadable eyes. "I manage fine." "I can see that." He took the handle anyway, not aggressively, just with the quiet certainty of a man who had made a decision. She let him, which surprised them both. They did not speak much. He carried the filled bucket to her gate without being asked. She said thank you at the end, the same 2 words she had said to him 7 years ago, and went inside without looking back. He stood at her gate for a moment longer than was necessary. The proposal, if it could be called that, came 11 days later. Silas had turned it over in his mind from every angle he could find. He was not a reckless man by nature. He was 31 years old, had worked ranches across 4 territories, had made and lost enough to know the weight of a foolish decision. What he was about to do sat somewhere between foolish and necessary, and he had stopped being able to tell the difference. He knocked on her door on a Thursday evening when the light was going gold over the ridge west of Delrose. She opened it and looked at him with that patient, empty expression, and he took his hat off and held it at his side. "Miss Pierce," he said, "I'd like to marry you." The silence that followed was the longest of his life. "You don't know me," she said finally. Her voice was not angry. It was barely anything. "I know enough." "Enough," she repeated, as though the word tasted strange. "What is it you think you know, Mr. Thornwell? Silas Thornwell." He held her gaze. "I know you're still here, and I know that costs you something every day, and I know that shouldn't be something a person carries alone." Savannah looked at him for a long moment, not with warmth, not with suspicion, with something closer to exhaustion, the kind that lives so deep it stops feeling like tiredness and starts feeling like simply the way things are. "I don't have anything to give a husband," she said. "I'm not asking you for anything," Silas said. "Not yet." She should have closed the door. She knew that. Every reasonable thought she had left told her to close the door on this strange, steady-eyed man and go back to the quiet that at least had the comfort of being familiar. She did not close the door. She stood there at the threshold of her own home, neither stepping back nor forward, and Silas waited, hat in hand, not pushing, not retreating, as though he had all the patience the world had ever made and had chosen to spend it right here. What she said next would change everything, but the words did not come easily, and the night was not finished asking its questions. She said yes, the way a person agrees to something they do not fully believe in yet, quietly, without ceremony, as though the word had slipped out before she could examine it too closely. "All right," Savannah said. Just that. No condition attached, no question following it. She stepped back from the doorway and let him in, and Silas crossed the threshold of her small house with the careful deliberateness of a man who understood that some invitations, once given, carry more weight than the words used to extend them. They sat at her kitchen table in the thin lamplight and worked out the practical details the way 2 people discuss the weather. Plainly, without drama. There would be no large ceremony. Judge Alderman and Delrose handled civil matters every second Friday. She would keep the house. He would move his things from the boarding room above Earl Dobbs' stable. Nothing about their arrangement needed to look like anything other than what it was. 2 people making a decision. What the decision meant was something neither of them said out loud. The town noticed, of course. Towns like Delrose always noticed. Hattie Cobb mentioned it to 3 women before noon on the day word got around, and by evening it had taken on the kind of shape that rumors take when people add their own assumptions to the edges. Some said Silas Thornwell must have money troubles and was after the house. Some said Savannah had finally done something practical. A few of the older women exchanged looks that said everything they chose not to speak aloud, that a man didn't marry a woman like that, a woman so folded inward, without some angle to it. Earl Dobbs said nothing to anyone. He just watched Silas load his 2 bags onto the back of his roan on a Friday morning and nodded once, slowly, the way old men nod when they have decided something is either very wise or very doomed, and cannot yet tell which. Silas nodded back and rode to Savannah's house. The first 2 weeks were the strangest of his life. He had expected distance. He had prepared himself for it, had told himself on the ride over and every morning after that distance was fine. That distance was the entire point, that she did not owe him warmth simply because he had chosen to be there. What he had not fully prepared for was how complete the distance was. Not cold, exactly. Not hostile. Simply vast. Like standing at the edge of a canyon and calling out and hearing nothing come back. Not even an echo. She cooked. He ate. He worked the cattle operation east of town through the days and came back in the evenings to a house that was clean and quiet and smelled faintly of the dried lavender she kept in a cracked jar on the windowsill. She asked him once if the food was to his liking. He said it was. She nodded and cleared the plates. He lay awake some nights listening to the silence of the house and wondering if he had miscalculated everything. It was a small thing that cracked the surface first. Small things usually were. He had come in late on a Thursday evening, later than usual. One of the cattle had gotten through a weak section of fence, and it had taken most of the afternoon to sort out. He was tired in the deep way that physical work layers on top of everything else a man is already carrying, and he came into the kitchen to find supper still warm on the stove, and Savannah sitting at the table with a book open in front of her that she was not reading. She was just sitting, hands flat on the table, eyes somewhere past the window. The lamp burned low beside her, and in that light she looked very young and very far away. Silas set his hat on the hook by the door and sat down across from her. He did not reach for the food right away. "Where do you go," he said, "when you look like that?" She blinked and came back into the room and looked at him with that measured expression. "I don't know what you mean." "Yes, you do." The quiet stretched between them. Outside, something moved in the brush near the back fence. A night animal, unhurried. "Nowhere," she said finally. "That's the honest answer. I don't go anywhere. I just stop being here for a while." It was the most she had said to him about herself in 2 weeks. He took it carefully, the way you take something fragile from someone's hands. "Does it help?" he asked. She considered the question with a seriousness that told him she was not used to being asked things that required real answers. "No," she said. "It just passes the time." He started talking to her after that. Not about important things, not at first. He talked the way you talk to someone you are trying to remind that conversation exists, that words between two people can be ordinary and still mean something. He told her about the ranch he had worked in his 20s up near the Colorado border, about a mule named Patterson, who had strong opinions about Mondays, about the one winter he had spent entirely alone in a line shack, and how he had started narrating his own actions out loud just to hear a voice. She listened. She did not always respond, but she listened with a quality of attention that told him she was not simply being polite. She was actually there, actually taking it in, and that felt like more than he had expected. One evening she said without preamble, "Why did you remember me?" He looked up from the leather strap he had been mending. "What do you mean?" "You said you knew enough, at the door when you came." She was not looking at him. She was tracing the grain of the table with one finger. "We met once, years ago. I barely remembered it. So why did you?" Silas set the strap down. He thought about giving her a simple answer. He decided she deserved the real one. "You laughed," he said, "at something one of the women near you said. And I don't know how to explain it. except that it was the kind of laugh that made the whole afternoon feel like it meant something. He paused. I thought about it for a long time after. Not in a strange way, just the way you carry a song sometimes without meaning to. Savannah's finger stopped moving on the table. That was a long time ago, she said quietly. I know. I don't laugh like that anymore. He looked at her steadily. I know that too. The shift, when it came, was not dramatic. There was no single moment that rewrote everything. It was more like the way a season changes. You cannot point to the exact morning winter becomes something else. But one day, you notice the ground is softer under your boots, and the light is staying a little longer, and something in the air has changed its mind. She started leaving his coffee on the stove in the mornings, not because she had to, because she had noticed he took it before he left, and she had started waking a few minutes earlier, and there it was, hot, without comment, without expectation. He noticed. He said nothing about it for 4 days. On the 5th morning, he came into the kitchen, and she was standing at the window with her own cup, and he picked up his and stood beside her, and they watched the early light move across the ridge together without speaking, and it was the most companionable either of them had felt in longer than they could honestly remember. But comfort, when it finally arrives after a long absence, has a way of frightening people. It was a Sunday, 3 weeks into their marriage, when Savannah did something that surprised them both. She had been hanging washing on the line behind the house, and Silas had come around the corner and said something offhand, something about the rooster that belonged to their neighbor Mr. Finch, who had apparently declared war on Silas personally every morning at first light. And Savannah had made a sound. Not quite a laugh. Not yet. But something adjacent to it. A breath that almost became something more. She caught it quickly, pressed her lips together, looked away. Silas said nothing. He did not make a show of it. He simply let it exist. But that night, lying in the quiet of the house, Savannah stared at the ceiling and felt something she had not felt in so long, she barely recognized it. A small, uncertain stirring. Not happiness. It was too fragile and too new to be called that. More like the first suggestion of a question she had stopped asking. What if? She did not finish the question. She was not ready for that. But for the first time in longer than she could measure, she did not push it away either. She fell asleep that night, with the question still sitting in her chest, unfinished and unfamiliar. And in the room across the narrow hallway, Silas lay awake, not with hope exactly, but with something that had not left him since the morning he had first seen her again at Hattie Cobb's counter. Patience. Stubborn, steady, quiet patience. What neither of them knew yet was that the town of Delrose had been watching, and towns like Delrose, when they have watched long enough, eventually decide to get involved. It was Hattie Cobb who said it first, loudly enough that 3 people heard it clearly, and 2 more caught the edges of it through the open door of the dry goods store on a Tuesday morning. That man married her out of pity, Hattie said, to no one in particular, and everyone present. And she accepted out of desperation. Mark my words, it won't hold. Savannah was not in the store when it was said, but words in a town like Delrose do not stay where they are spoken. They travel the way dust travels, on the air, settling into places you did not expect, coating things you thought were clean. She heard it by Wednesday afternoon. From Joanna Pierce, her second cousin, who told her with the careful expression of someone delivering bad news they have partially enjoyed collecting. Joanna sat across from her at the kitchen table and said, I just thought you should know what people are saying, Savannah. Before it gets back to you, some harder way. Savannah listened. She kept her hands flat on the table the way she always did when she was working to feel nothing. She thanked Joanna for coming. She walked her to the door. Then she stood in the middle of her kitchen for a long time. Silas came home that evening to a house that felt different. He could not have explained it precisely. Nothing was out of place. Supper was on the stove. The lamp was lit. But Savannah was sitting at the table with that old expression back on her face, the one he had not seen in weeks, the faraway one, the one that meant she had gone somewhere inside herself and pulled the door shut behind her. He sat down. He waited. "People are saying you married me out of pity," she said. Her voice was even, almost too even. Silas looked at her steadily. "People say a great many things. Is it true?" The question landed in the space between them, with a weight that deserved a real answer, not a careful one. He knew the difference. He had known her long enough now to understand that she had a sharp instinct for when someone was managing her rather than speaking to her, and that being managed was one of the few things that still made her eyes go sharp. "No," he said. "It is not pity." "Then what is it?" He was quiet for a moment, not because he did not know, because he was deciding how much of the truth she was ready to hold. "I told you about the laugh," he said finally, "at the harvest social, 7 years ago. You did. What I didn't tell you was that I looked for you after. Not in a searching way. I wasn't even sure what town you were from, but I thought about you. Off and on, the way you think about something you can't quite name." He folded his hands on the table. "When I walked into Hattie Cobb's that morning and saw you standing at the counter, I recognized you in about 3 seconds, and then I watched you for 3 weeks before I came to your door." Savannah was very still. "That's not pity," he said. "Pity is what you feel for a stranger. What I felt was closer to, I don't have a clean word for it, something between recognition and refusal." "Refusal of what?" "Of watching you disappear." He held her gaze. "I have seen a lot of things I couldn't do anything about. I decided this wasn't going to be one of them." She did not respond right away. She sat with what he had said the way she sat with most things, carefully, turning it over, checking it from different angles for the places where it might crack or prove false. It did not crack. That was the part she did not know what to do with. She went to bed that night and lay awake and thought about the word he had used. Refusal. Such a plain word for such a complicated thing. She thought about what it meant that someone had looked at her, at the quiet, hollowed, going through the motions version of herself, and had chosen not to look away. Not because they needed something from her, not because they felt sorry, but because they had seen something worth staying for. She was not certain she believed that yet, but she was no longer certain she disbelieved it. The following week, Silas came home to find Savannah in the small garden behind the house, on her knees in the dirt, pulling weeds from around the base of a rose bush that had been so neglected it had gone almost entirely to thorn. Her hands were dirty. There was a smudge of soil along her jaw. She looked up when she heard him, and something crossed her face that was not quite an expression, more like the beginning of one. "It was my mother's," she said, nodding at the rose bush. "I stopped tending it after she passed. I don't know why I started again today." Silas crouched down beside her without being asked, and began clearing the ground on the other side of the bush. They worked in silence for a while, the way people work together when words would only get in the way. After a time, she said quietly, "Silas." "Yes. I don't know how to be the way I was before." She sat back on her heels and looked at her dirty hands. "I'm not sure that person is still in there." "I'm not asking for that person," he said. He did not stop working. "I'm asking for the one right here." Savannah looked at him for a long moment. The evening light was coming low and golden over the ridge, and it caught the side of his face, and he was just a man on his knees in the dirt beside her, asking for nothing she could not give. Something in her chest moved. Not the tentative almost feeling from weeks ago. Something more deliberate. More awake. She looked back at the rose bush and kept working. The first time she truly laughed, it happened without warning. It was an ordinary Saturday morning. Silas had gone out to the back lot to deal with a loose board on the fence and had apparently underestimated the ambitions of Mr. Finch's rooster, who had followed him out there and was now engaged in what could only be described as a personal grievance campaign, circling Silas with the focused hostility of a creature that had decided this particular man was a problem that needed solving. Savannah watched from the kitchen window. Silas was attempting to ignore the rooster with great dignity. The rooster was not interested in his dignity. It made another pass, and Savannah laughed. It came out of her the way the almost laugh had not, fully, without being caught and pulled back, spilling into the quiet kitchen and filling the corners of it. She pressed a hand over her mouth, but it was already out, already real, already alive in the room. She stood there afterward with her hand still over her lips and her eyes bright, and something moving through her chest that was warm and unfamiliar and not frightening at all. When Silas came inside a few minutes later, with a look of great wounded dignity on his face, she was still smiling. She couldn't stop. She did not particularly want to. He saw it immediately. He did not say a word about it. He simply went to the stove and poured his coffee and stood with his back to her for just long enough that she would not see what crossed his face. But his shoulders had loosened, and his hands were still. It did not all resolve cleanly after that. That was not how real things worked, and both of them were old enough to know it. There were still evenings when Savannah went quiet and distant, and Silas gave her the space without making her explain it. There were still mornings when she woke feeling the old weight of nothing in particular, and had to decide again, the same small decision, over and over, to get up and put the coffee on and stay in the world one more day. But the decision got easier. That was the thing she had not expected. It got easier in the specific, quiet way that things get easier when you are not making them alone. She told him she loved him on a Wednesday evening in November, 3 months after they married. No occasion, no particular moment that had built to it. They were washing up after supper, and she handed him the drying cloth and looked at him and said, "I love you, Silas." Simply, like a fact she had finished verifying and was ready to state. He took the cloth. He looked at her with an expression that was not surprise exactly, more like the look of a man who has been waiting a long time for a train and is watching it finally come around the bend. "I know," he said, and then, softer, "I love you too. I have for a long time." She nodded, as though that settled something, and went back to washing the pot. They were married in the full sense of the word long before the town of Delrose decided to revise its opinion of them, which it eventually did. Towns always do when the evidence becomes impossible to ignore. People noticed the way Savannah moved through Delrose now, not the mechanical walk of someone filling time, but the unhurried ease of someone who had somewhere to return to. They noticed the garden coming back to life, the rose bush throwing out new green growth in the spring, the lamp burning warm in the window later into the evenings. Hattie Cobb did not officially retract anything she had said. But she did, one morning, watch Silas hold the door of her store open for Savannah, and watch Savannah look up at him with that quiet, certain expression. And Hattie found something else to look at very quickly, which was as close to an apology as she had ever come. Their daughter was born the following autumn. They named her Ruth. She had Savannah's eyes and Silas's patience, which everyone who knew them agreed was a fortunate combination. Savannah sat in the chair by the window on the first morning home from town, holding Ruth against her chest and watching the early light come over the ridge, the same ridge she had watched from this window for years, the same light she had let pass through her without letting it touch her for longer than she could honestly account for. It touched her now. She let it. Silas brought her coffee and sat on the edge of the bed nearby and watched his wife and his daughter in the morning light and did not say anything at all. He did not need to. Some things do not require words. They only require someone willing to stay long enough for them to become true. If slow-burn stories about ordinary people making extraordinary choices are what you come back for, there are more of them waiting for you. And before you go, this story traveled to find you today. Whether you are sitting somewhere in the American South, watching from a quiet corner of Europe, tucked into an evening in Asia, or catching this on a warm afternoon somewhere in Africa or South America, would you let us know in the comments where in the world this story reached you? There is something remarkable about a tale born in the dust of the old frontier finding its way to your screen, wherever that screen happens to be. And if something in this story moved you, or if there is something you would have written differently, a direction you wish it had taken, something you felt was missing or could be more, please tell us. Every comment shapes what comes next. This channel grows because of the people watching it, and your voice in that conversation genuinely matters.